In the magnificent theatre of Tudor England, Queen Elizabeth I emerged not just as a ruler, but as a symbol. A sovereign of unshakable will, razor-sharp intellect, and a carefully sculpted mystique that blurred the line between woman and myth. Her image, the Virgin Queen untouched by man, draped in pearls and powdered majesty, was no accident. It was a political performance. A living portrait painted daily with precision. History celebrates her for triumphs like the defeat of the Spanish Armada, the golden age of English arts, and the solidification of England's Protestant identity. But beneath the grandeur, behind the heavily embroidered gowns and layers of ceremonial grace, stood a woman fiercely obsessed with control. Control of her court. Control of her public image. And above all, control of how her body was perceived, even as it quietly broke down behind closed doors. In a time when bathing was more spiritual ritual than hygienic necessity, Queen Elizabeth's approach to cleanliness was, even by the standards of the 16th century, shockingly unique. Her physical routines weren't simply reflective of her era, they were curated tools of image-making. Every choice, from scent to skin, was part of an illusion. The Virgin Queen was meant to appear beyond flesh and filth, immune to decay, untouched by time or water. Today we journey into the most intimate, rarely spoken aspects of Elizabeth's reign, her personal hygiene. 5 practices, strange, revealing, and deeply human, that lift the velvet curtain on how one of history's most iconic monarchs maintained her illusion of divine perfection, while her body waged a very human rebellion beneath the silk. At the glittering heart of her court, amidst poets, jesters, and velvet-draped rituals, lay a secret addiction: sugar. In Elizabethan England, sugar was more than a sweet treat. It was imported luxury, locked in iron chests, guarded like treasure. To possess it was to wield status. And Elizabeth? She didn't just enjoy sugar. She devoured it. Candied violets, preserved oranges, marzipan molded into royal shapes. It was said that her banquets overflowed with sweets, decadent confections fit for a queen rising with a wealthy empire. But sugar, though royal in taste, was ruinous in consequence. The queen's dental hygiene, if it can be called that, involved brushing with a paste of honeyed herbs and sugar. Ironically, the very substance that delighted her tongue also destroyed her teeth. Combined with rough powders meant to scrub, this paste wore down the enamel, exposing the roots beneath to decay and infection. By the later years of her reign, reports from foreign diplomats painted a painful picture. Elizabeth's once enchanting smile had turned black. Several teeth had rotted and fallen out entirely. Her breath, wrote herbalist John Gerard, was so foul it caused discomfort to those in close conversation. Some whispered that her speech had become slurred, garbled, difficult to follow, because of the gaps left behind. Yet, despite the visible agony, she refused to allow extractions. She would not be seen as weak. In one extraordinary episode, a loyal courtier agreed to have a tooth pulled out in front of her, simply to prove the pain was survivable. Still, the queen resisted. Pain was preferable to vulnerability. But perhaps most unsettling of all was what followed. Noblewomen at court, in an effort to imitate their monarch, began blackening their own teeth, using soot and charcoal to stain their smiles. In Elizabeth's world, even rot became fashionable. Tooth decay transformed into a symbol of wealth, of access to sugar, and most importantly, of devotion to the queen. In Tudor England, to look like Elizabeth, even in suffering, was to be seen. And so, her image endured, perfectly crafted, endlessly copied, and deeply deceptive. Among the many phrases attributed to Elizabeth, one stands out in haunting irony. "I bathe once a month, whether I need it or not." While the authenticity of the quote may be debated, its sentiment echoes the worldview of a time when water was considered not a purifier, but a potential peril. To bathe too often was to invite disease. It was believed that overexposure to water could disturb the body's humors, open pores to the corrupt air, or draw in the dreaded miasma that many thought carried plague and death. For Queen Elizabeth I, bathing was not part of daily routine. Instead, she followed a regimen both ritualistic and symbolic. At the center of it was linen, specifically the frequent changing of her undergarments known as linen shifts. These were the garments worn closest to the skin, and in Elizabeth's court, they were changed sometimes multiple times a day. The logic of the time dictated that the linen would draw out impurities from the body, acting as a living sponge that cleansed through contact alone. To her contemporaries, this was more than acceptable. It was refined. Cleanliness wasn't judged by scent or soap, but by fabric, fragrance, and finesse. Rather than soap and water, Elizabeth preferred elaborate alternatives. Rose water steeped with petals, vinegar rinses laced with herbs, and custom infusions created by royal apothecaries. These were gently applied by her ladies-in-waiting, not to cleanse but to maintain a sense of divine freshness. These concoctions were thought to protect the queen not just from filth, but from spiritual or moral contamination. Her palaces, grand as they were, had no plumbing. A bath, when it did occur, was a royal operation. Wooden tubs had to be carried in. Buckets of warm water were hauled from the kitchens. At least 3 servants were required to assist. The ritual was so cumbersome that full-body bathing became an event reserved for rare occasions. A ceremony, not a habit. It was prepared with the same precision as a diplomatic banquet or a coronation. And yet, in the eyes of her time, Elizabeth was considered impeccably clean. She was draped in hundreds of gowns, layered in perfume-soaked gloves, and surrounded by scented handkerchiefs. Her hygiene was not about sanitation, it was about illusion. She wasn't unclean because she was careless. She avoided water because it threatened to dismantle the elaborate mask she presented to the world. That mask extended to her face, one of the most iconic visages in history. Porcelain pale, smooth, nearly otherworldly. But that face wasn't natural, it was engineered. In an era that idolized whiteness as the hallmark of nobility and divine favor, Elizabeth wielded cosmetics as political armor. Her chosen foundation? Venetian ceruse, a toxic blend of white lead and vinegar. This fatal formula gave her the illusion of flawless, luminous skin. But behind the mirror, it destroyed what it was meant to enhance. Slowly, insidiously, it ate away at her real skin, leaving behind scarring, sores, and an increasing need for thicker and heavier application. Her lip stain, made from cinnabar or vermilion, rich with mercury, only added to the damage. Over time, her health weakened. Mood swings grew more erratic. Symptoms aligned eerily with mercury poisoning, tremors, paranoia, and fatigue. Still, she wore her paint. Why? Because her face was not hers alone. It belonged to the crown. Her features had become a national emblem, unchangeable, invincible, eternal. She weaponized her image to control her court, silence opposition, and defy aging itself. Artists were forbidden to paint her as she truly appeared. Instead, official portraits reused stylized facial templates, idealized features lifted from her youthful likeness. Realism was a threat. Truth was dangerous. By the twilight of her reign, Elizabeth's face had become a literal mask. Courtiers whispered that her makeup was so thick, so fragile, that to touch it was to risk crumbling the illusion, and perhaps the queen herself. Historians continue to debate whether Elizabeth knew the full extent of the poison she applied daily. But one truth stands firm. She believed the myth of Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, must be preserved, even if her body deteriorated beneath it. She did not often wash her face. To do so would have stripped away not just the lead, but the legend. Behind the finely stitched tapestries and beneath ceilings gilded with gold, Elizabethan palaces concealed a far less regal truth. They stank. For all their splendor, the great royal residences of Queen Elizabeth I, like Hampton Court and Richmond Palace, were more medieval in function than their majestic exteriors suggested. There was no plumbing, no running water, no toilets as we know them. The Queen herself, sovereign of the most powerful court in England, relieved herself on what was called a close stool, a richly upholstered chair with a hole in the seat, beneath which rested a ceramic chamber pot. This pot was not left for nameless servants to clean. No, it was emptied, scrubbed, and delicately perfumed multiple times a day by one of the highest-ranking officials at court, the groom of the stool. Despite what the title implies, this was no menial job. The groom of the stool was often a nobleman of great trust, discretion, and influence. He was granted access to the queen in her most vulnerable moments, helping not only with hygiene but also dressing and even private political counsel. The position, though rooted in bodily function, was a seat of power, a role many at court vied for, not avoided. Yet beyond the queen's perfumed chamber, palace sanitation was a different story. Across the sprawling court, hundreds of chamber pots were used daily. Human waste was carted away by workers known as gong farmers, or night soil men. Under cover of darkness, they carried sloshing pails of filth down winding staircases, through torchlit corridors and into courtyards, their destination. Pits dug just outside palace walls or in many cases, directly beneath the buildings themselves. These cesspits were cesspools in the truest sense, foul, disease-ridden, and constantly on the verge of overflow. The stench they emitted was not just unpleasant, it was inescapable. To combat the ever-present odor, the palace relied on sensory illusion. Lavender, rosemary, and marjoram were scattered across stone floors or burned as incense. Rushes, straw-like plants, were spread over floorboards and perfumed with oils. But these rushes weren't cleaned or changed often. Beneath them festered layers of dirt, shed hair, rotting food, and filth too shameful to speak of. The court's opulence stood atop a bed of decay. Even Elizabeth's travel schedule was part of her hygiene strategy. She moved regularly from palace to palace, not just for diplomacy but to escape the stench. Without plumbing, no royal residence could remain fresh for long. The longer the court stayed in one place, the worse the conditions became, and the closer illness crept in. This was the paradox of Elizabeth's world. Velvet cushions hiding chamber pots, gilded halls perfumed to disguise rot, and a queen cloaked in jewels who ruled beside the unrelenting odor of the human body. To truly understand Elizabeth's hygiene, one must understand her deepest obsession: control. Her entire body, from the powdered mask of her face to the gloves on her hands, was not a display of vanity but of authority. She had learned that power, once questioned, could be torn away. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, had been executed after being painted as weak, emotional, unstable. Elizabeth would never risk such a fate. In Tudor England, water was not only scarce, it was dangerous. To bathe was to strip bare, to soften skin, to risk disease, vulnerability, and scrutiny. Elizabeth refused this exposure. Instead, she enveloped herself in a carefully crafted ritual of scented armor. Every day, her ladies-in-waiting prepared herbal infusions in the palace still rooms, elaborate blends of lavender, rose petals, orris root, cloves, rosemary, steeped in vinegar or distilled spirits. These solutions were not just for fragrance, they were for protection. Applied with cloths, dabs, and gentle pats, they created a barrier between her flesh and the world. This was not just hygiene. It was politics, power, myth-making. And in Elizabeth's court, myth mattered more than truth. The fragrant waters Elizabeth relied on were never meant to cleanse, only to conceal. Each application was a performance. A dab of rose water on her wrists, a delicate mist behind the ears. And with these subtle rituals, the queen would glide through court, not leaving behind the smell of sweat, but an aura, carefully crafted, deliberately orchestrated. She carried pomanders, ornate, orb-shaped containers filled with resins, herbs, and fragrant oils, nestled inside her bodice or fastened to her jeweled belt. When foul odors from the palace overwhelmed her senses, she simply raised the sphere to her nose and inhaled a world that smelled nothing like the one she ruled. But these scents weren't just practical. They were symbolic. They drew a line, invisible but powerful, between Elizabeth and everyone else. While common folk battled stench with water and coarse soap, the queen conquered it with fragrance and ritual. Her scent was her sanctuary, her strategy, her wall. Even her garments were woven into this sensory fortress. Her gloves were perfumed, her handkerchiefs stitched with golden thread and steeped in essential oils. Her layered gowns, stiff with embroidery and lined with fabric, didn't just hide her figure. They helped trap and preserve the sense of her curated identity. She would even gift scented gloves to favored courtiers, a token of intimacy but one that shared the scent, not the skin. Hair washing too was out of the question. Her natural hair, often hidden beneath elaborate wigs, was dusted with scented powder, stiffened with sugar water or egg whites to hold form. As the years passed and her real hair thinned from age and chronic lead exposure, she turned to auburn wigs, curled, perfumed, and arranged with militant precision. But even the strongest perfume cannot halt decay. Beneath the violet oil and camphor dust, her body aged. Her skin, damaged by decades of toxic cosmetics, grew fragile. Sores appeared. The once untouched face became marred with flaking lesions. Whispers echoed through the palace of patches that could not be covered, of skin that no longer bore touch. Still, Elizabeth clung to her rituals, more fiercely than ever. In her final years, she became intensely private, even paranoid. She would not be painted unless the portrait followed strict instructions. No wrinkles, no sagging, no blemishes. The woman in the frame must appear timeless, eternal. She banned mirrors from her chambers. Some claimed she employed a maid whose only duty was to reapply powder to her shoulders when no one else was present. Every moment was a chance to preserve the illusion. To bathe, truly deeply bathe, would have shattered it all. The water would reveal the truth. The creased skin, the scent of age, the crumbling edges of a woman who had ruled for decades. Washing her face meant stripping off not just powder but power. In time, Elizabeth carried a scented walking stick, and would subtly lift it beneath her nose when passing courtiers whose natural odors offended her. This wasn't just a gesture of disgust, it was theater. A performance of supremacy, reminding those around her that she was untouchable. Beyond flesh, beyond smell, beyond decay, her body no longer belonged to herself. It had become an extension of the crown, a living relic, a myth painted onto skin. Cleanliness in the Queen's world had nothing to do with health. It had everything to do with image. And in Elizabeth's court, image was survival. Queen Elizabeth I remains one of history's most unforgettable monarchs, not because she was flawless, but because she understood something few dared to accept. The illusion of power is sometimes more important than power itself. Her rituals were not rooted in vanity. They were weapons. A stillness mistaken for cleanliness. A fragrance mistaken for divinity. A mask mistaken for immortality. Elizabeth did not wash away her image. She preserved it with every powdered cheek, every perfumed glove, every forbidden mirror. She may not have been clean in the modern sense, but she was never ordinary. She was not just a queen. She was a symbol, and symbols once broken cannot be remade. In the royal court of Elizabeth I, cleanliness was never about soap or water. It was about survival through illusion. And in that illusion, she reigned supreme.